Welcome to Pep Talks, the Patient Engagement Podcast, brought to you by the Alberta Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Support Unit Patient Engagement Team. I'm your host, Sandra Zielinski. Join us for insightful discussions with patient, family, and community research partners, academic researchers, clinicians, policymakers, and other stakeholders on the topic of partnerships in patient-oriented research and patient engagement in health research and healthcare. In this episode, we talk about the repurposing the ordering of routine laboratory tests, also known as the RePORT study, which is being conducted and implemented in Alberta and British Columbia. Hospitals frequently conduct routine blood tests, which not only cause patient discomfort, but also significantly contribute to healthcare waste. Choosing Wisely Canada highlights that repetitive, routine blood tests are linked to increased mortality risks, advising against the repetitive testing in hospitalized patients. St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto documented high rates of routine blood testing, which was associated with worsening anemia. In response, a targeted initiative aimed to reduce these tests by 15% hospital-wide. These efforts involved raising awareness about local test rates, educating clinicians on the adverse effects of routine testing, and revising order protocols to eliminate unnecessary tests. The RePORT study adopts an innovative approach by involving individuals with lived experiences as active and equal partners throughout the research study. This collaborative effort is crucial in gaining insights into patient perspectives and experiences, as well as enhancing engagement with in-hospital laboratory testing. It's important to note that the term patient is inclusive of informal family caregivers and community members involved in supporting patients in their care. I'm excited to introduce you to our two guests, Dr. Anshula Ambasta and Anni Rychtera. Dr. Anshula Ambasta is a general internal medicine physician and assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesia, Pharmacology, and Therapeutics at University of British Columbia's Faculty of Medicine. Her research focuses on improving the value of healthcare services using evidence-based implementation strategies. Dr. Ambasta is the principal applicant for the CIHR-funded research study on repurpose the ordering of routine laboratory tests in hospitalized medical patients. Anni Rychtera is a health sciences college educator and former nurse practitioner with a background in holistic health. As an immigrant and mother of two, her personal health challenges include respiratory illness, nerve pain from sports injury, and as a cancer survivor. These experiences have shaped her advocacy for informed patient care and equal health partnerships. She has volunteered extensively with University of Victoria's self-management programs and the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Over a decade ago, she started collaborating with CIHR SPORE and the BC SPORE Support Unit on patient-oriented research activities. She has co-chaired the SPORE Patient Engagement National Community of Practice, or SPENCOP, and is a co-chair for the RePORT Patient Advisory Council. Welcome, Anshula and Anni.
Thought we could get started with maybe sharing some background information and goals of the repurposing the ordering of routine laboratory tests, or the RePORT study. Anshula, do you want to start us off and share a little bit about the RePORT study and how this came to be?
Sure. Yes. Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you for inviting us to the show. So, as you mentioned, RePORT is an acronym which stands for repurposing the ordering of routine laboratory tests in hospitalized patients. And the idea for this project came to me when I was doing my training in internal medicine. And one of the things I noticed was that every day people admitted in hospital would get woken up very early by the laboratory personnel to get their blood work drawn. And even before we started rounding on patients, we would see all of their blood work results documented. And this was just sort of the culture that was in hospital. And as I got more and more senior during my training years, I started talking to more attending physicians about why we do this and what is the utility of it. And I heard more and more from people that this is just something that's part of hospital practice. It's very cultural, it's ingrained. The growth in technology and the ability for us to do more testing has led to this thing of, well, the more data we have, the better, the more tests we do, the better it is. It wasn't until my fourth year of training when one of the attending physicians called me and said, hey, I know you've been asking and talking about this. I think we can do a little bit more. I think we're doing more testing than we should. And I think we should be doing a little bit more optimally. And this is the time when Choosing Wisely Canada was also gaining more and more recognition and prominence. And there was this idea that uh, perhaps we are doing more lab testing in hospitals than we should. So this is sort of how this project originated and started. And the first kind of pilot that we did with this project was just providing some education to physicians about some of these downsides of over testing, and also providing them a report, hence the acronym, a report of what their utilization is relative to their peers. And just with that pilot, there was tons of interest at that one site. A lot of physicians came and asked me and said, hey, I'm very curious about this lab testing project, and tell me a little bit more about these educational resources. And is it okay to not have to poke every single person in hospital every single day? And people who were on the very high ends of ordering tests often came to me and said, oh, I didn't realize that there are other docs who order much fewer tests and still have good outcomes for their patients. So it started that conversation. And that is how I decided that this is something that's worth pursuing through a proper kind of, started as a quality improvement project with a pilot, but then we thought, well, this is something can develop a research program around. So this is the origin of RePORT. And in terms of the overall goals, the overall goal of RePORT is really just to optimize the use of laboratory testing for hospitalized patients. It really is about the fact that we want the right test to be available for the right patient when they need it. And we don't want to be clogging up the system by ordering too many tests and then delaying the ordering of tests when it really should be happening for those patients. So the goal of RePORT is that if you're in hospital and you need a test, you get it done right at the time that you need it. And if you don't need that test and you can save yourself that poke, then let's do that. And let's just be more purposeful about ordering tests rather than thinking that routinely ordering tests and collecting more data is just better.
Thank you, Angela. So just to give a little background, I've known you now for, I think, I don't know, I'm just throwing a number as highlights. Feels like it's like 4 years now or something. And I have not heard the story told this way. So it's really nice to hear it framed in that way, because I was actually involved in some of this work early on that one of the things that you chose to do is to establish a patient advisory council. So bringing patient research partners to the team to work together throughout the research process. Do you want to talk about the planning and execution of that part of the research and why you decided to do that?
Yes, I think it has been nearly 4 years, Sandra, that we've been working on this project. And as I mentioned, as we transitioned from this just being a quality improvement pilot at one site to really making it more of a research program, I knew early on that we needed to have the patient voice in this. It is really the patients who are getting woken up in the morning, getting that poke in their skin, and it's their blood that we're drawing, and it is their results that we need to share, and it's their care that's being impacted. So I knew early that they needed to be very involved in this project and that we needed to hear things from their side. What I really needed at that time was to figure out how to do this. And I was very fortunate because while I was applying for funding for this research program, I was able to connect with the patient engagement team from the Alberta SPORE support unit. And I connected with Dr. Maria Santana, who is a leading expert in this field. And I put together sort of an idea of this is how I think we should be engaging patients. And Dr. Santana was very kind. She met with me and she said, well, these are good thoughts. I appreciate the intent, but perhaps you can think about some of these other methods. And so I came and I presented at one of the Apps for You meetings, and I presented to other patient research partners. And I think that's how we connected, Sandra, because you were part of the meeting. And I really think from that point onward, it was very much co-design, because what I came in with was the notion that we should have the patient voice in this, and how the patient voice developed, and even the idea for the patient advisory council really kind of was an organic growth of discussion that happened between myself and the patient engagement team, yourself, Sandra, and also the wealth and experience that the patient research partners brought to the team. And I will say the funding that we received from CIHR and the patient-oriented research sort of priority funding from CIHR, which is what allowed all of this to happen.
Yeah, great. And I'd like to loop Anni into the conversation. So Anni is one of the current co-chairs for the Patient Advisory Council. Do you want to build on some of the work that you're doing together as a research team, but specifically Patient Advisory Council and the importance of this work?
Yeah, I'd like to go a step back actually in terms of like the goals, like just stress that from a patient perspective. With this study, like we really hope that we can empower patients to ask questions and not just taking because the test is ordered, so we'll follow the order. As like for patients to be able to ask questions like, why is this test being done? Why, what does it mean to my healthcare? Does it really change anything in my care plan? Facilitate this communication between healthcare practitioners and patients. That was one of the goals of the study from a patient perspective. And early on, as we did interviews with the patient participants and the family caregivers, we heard that it is really important. They want to be involved in this whole process. They want to make decisions regarding their healthcare. They want healthcare practitioners to really take the time to talk to them. So communication is essential. It also, we know from experience that, and Anjula mentioned it was started with a quality improvement project. If we want to change healthcare practices, we do have to involve the people who are most affected by it. And so people with lived experience, you mentioned that, lived or living experience as partners in the research project is essential, in my opinion. With forming the PAC, forming a diverse group of patient partners with diverse background, diverse demographics, giving input, being partners and fully collaborate in this project, that brings the patient voice really to the forefront. With that, change can be maintained, I think. So in this project, I found that the research team, with the help also from the Alberta SPOR unit, there was a really good collaboration with everybody involved in every aspect of the project. And the contribution of the patient research partner really led to changes in the study design. And a prime example, for instance, is early on, where originally the study question was worded like looking at barriers and facilitators around the appropriate lab testing, changing it to the experience and the perspective. So trying to understand the patient and caregiver needs and perspectives. So to me, this is a major shift, really listening to the patient voice, take the input from the patient voice and form it around that.
Thank you so much, Anni. Actually, do you want to carry on a little bit and talk about, so I think in patient-oriented research, we have a lot of resources, kind of like the how-to, but it's nice to hear some practical examples of how people are working together in health research. And I'm wondering if you want to expand on some of the roles and the work that you've done together and the involvement of patient research partners in this study. Do you want to expand on some of that?
Yeah, I'd like to. Like as Anjula mentioned, like the patient partners were actively involved in the grant application, for instance, making sure that the funds are there for the research study to do. With the SPOR or the patient-oriented research strategy and initiatives, though it is of importance that patient partners are involved early on, right from forming the research question to writing the applications, and the RePORT project, the research team collaborated with patients right from the beginning. So that's part of why also the grant applications then are successful. The second part was like really for the ethics approval and having the patient voice actively there, and really helps that getting these approvals. Patient partners also were essential in creating the consent form, then the recruitment poster for the study participants. So really have it user-friendly, understandable is very important. The interview guide was co-created with the whole team as a teamwork, fully collaboration. The patient research partners were also involved then as co-interviewees and designing the code book for the data analysis. Like Anshula mentioned, there is the pack. So it was a diverse group, and not just involving between 9 and 11 patient research partners. We also had the principal investigators with Anshula on the team, research assistant and coordinators, the support team for patient engagement from the Alberta SPOR unit initially, as well as some clinicians, as well as scientific support and specialists in different areas. Like what we added later on was the human-centered design specialist to work within the team. Patient partners also were co-chairs or are co-chairs together with one of the research team members. So we always have 2 patient partner co-chairs. The whole project was pretty much a collaboration, teamwork, and with the emphasis of really co-designing all of our outputs. Like we had outputs like the infographic, the video, the website. We go into that a little bit later on. But with the co-design, the close relationship with all the members, and especially with the members of the lived experience, so it was made sure that our main focus was on usability, understandability, as well as we had one example, for instance, avoiding sensitive images. So the input from the patients carried a lot of weight. And changes were made around like lay language summaries, and like I mentioned, the pictures, like avoiding pictures with sensitive images. I experienced always a environment of really mutual respect, ongoing support. Lots of training was offered for the patient partners to really expand on their research skills and to be able to work fully alongside the research team. So personally, I appreciated that very, very much. And it was one of the contributors to lasting relationships. So people are involved in the project. We don't have much turnover, and so it's long-lasting relationships.
Thanks, Annie. I'm wondering, Anshula, because you're bringing the clinician researcher perspective, if you want to talk a little bit about if there was anything that was maybe surprising or your experience working with a patient advisory council, patient research partners as active and equal members of this research team, and what that's been like from your perspective.
It's a great question. I just feel like I've been on this steep learning curve ever since we started with the patient advisory council, and there are a lot of little learning points and some big kind of aha moments for me. As Annie was mentioning, one of the first studies we had planned alongside the patient advisory council had been, well, maybe we should ask patients about their lab testing in hospital. And of course, the research team had our ideas about, we should ask them about barriers and facilitators to appropriate testing. And as Annie mentioned, we first needed to know what their baseline experience was like, and we needed to keep it more open. And it was that point of realization that the lived experience of people is different. They're seeing it through their lens and through what their care is and what matters to them. Whereas sometimes I've tended to have this more of a system-based lens of like, well, this works for the system and this is appropriate and whatnot. So it really helped me see that when we involve people with lived experience, we're completely changing our lens. We're going from the system, health system focused lens to what matters to an individual in their care. And that was sort of one of the big aha moments. Then there was these little things that I picked up on where we received feedback on what's important to put in a recruitment poster. And the language in the recruitment poster, it shouldn't really be us versus them. It really should be more inviting, how welcoming we are in the recruitment poster, but also how respectful we are with respect to their experiences was important. And all of that was reflected in how we shaped the consent form. So somebody mentioned about, potential risks of joining the study was that one of the patient partners mentioned that, hey, one of the risks could be that it could trigger negative memories of being in hospital or trigger some trauma. And those are things that we hadn't thought about. So it really was a learning curve for me to see how it is that the experience of hospitalization it is for the individual person compared to viewing it from a system level perspective. The other thing that I really appreciated, and I have continued to do so over the past 4 years, is how much of a challenge it is for patient partners to be engaged in research. They are people who are professionals in other environments. They have their own work, they have their own commitments and responsibilities, and they also have often a medical condition, maybe more, that they're trying to balance. And on top of those things, they're then committing to these things and willing to learn about research and wanting to have a voice in it. So I really saw that to be able to participate actively as a partner in research, there's a lot of commitment that the people in the pack had. And we had to try to do everything we could to make it easier for them, which involved things like making sure there's breaks in the meetings, the timings of the meetings, recording things, moving away from difficult to access institutional folders to more accessible online folders so people can have access to those things. So that was the key learning thing for me, is that it's actually quite difficult for people to be able to continue, and we have to do everything on our part. And then the other thing that was surprising to me was how much enthusiasm there was in people to learn about research. People wanted to really immerse themselves. They wanted to learn and not just participate in the interviews, but wanted to learn how to really thematically analyze it. And I thought that was really inspiring for me because it showed me that they don't just want to have a consultative role. They really want to be there doing the research so that it truly comes from a place that's outside of somebody who has an outsider lens to the research. So I think that was a really inspiring moment for me, was to see how much people are willing to put in to expand their skill set and learn and commit. So those were, I think, some of the key takeaways that I had. And I'm, like I said, I'm still learning. It's still a curve that I'm on. One of the things that I've also noticed recently more so is that there is so much enthusiasm for people to go and present and share the work that we've had. So people have really taken the initiative in picking conferences and suggesting, hey, I'd like to go to this conference versus this is a good conference. Let's try to present something there. And I have had to do very little, if any, work with respect to picking the conferences. That's all been done by them. I've just tried to provide the support, some of the expense reimbursement, those pieces. But there's been a lot of initiative from people to be like, we have done this work, let's share this. And I've also seen the power of the work when it's shared by a patient research partner versus by a research team. I think it's just when it's shared by a patient research partner, everybody connects. And there was so much surprise in researchers' minds. They're like, wow, this is what, this is how involved the research partners on your team were. And we're like, and we're so proud to say, yes, they were. Like, they can go and independently present this qualitative research study because they understand it from beginning to the end.
Thank you so much for sharing your reflections, Anchila. I think it's interesting to hear from your perspective as a clinician researcher that experience and those key learnings and, how it's evolved and changed, I guess, over time for yourself. So I think this is a good time to discuss some of the key findings that came from the RePORT study. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about some of the findings that came from the interviews that you co-conducted, as well as the human-centered design process that this team also co-conducted and co-designed.
So yeah, if I want to may start in terms of the key findings from the interviews, because we were actively involved, we were a partner on the interview team, collecting the information from the study participants. For me, one of the key findings what really stood out is that patients, caregivers, their families, they really want to be actively involved in the decision making. Like, when will be blood tests done? How often will they be done? But also they ask really for the healthcare practitioners to take the time to discuss that with them and afterwards inform them about the results of the tests and interpret them in an understandable way. And what does it mean to my care? So does that change anything in my treatment plan, in my outcomes? So really this active involvement of the patients in their own care, and people demanding that. And then they really ask for better communication, more time, not rushing. And just is like, okay, yeah, blood tests, nothing unusual, things like that. So it's like, why are you doing it if you don't then explain, or if it doesn't change anything in the outcome for me as a patient?
And Sheila, did you want to add anything to the interview findings?
Yeah, I agree with everything Annie said. The overall takeaway for me was that patients want a lot more recognition of their self and their autonomy in hospital. And that extends to the hospital blood testing process, everywhere from the decision to draw blood to when and what time it's drawn, to how the results are shared and how it affect their care plan. They want to be part of all of those things, and they want to have that information. Central to all of this and their experience is that good communication between the healthcare team and the patient.
So can you tell us how those findings informed the human-centered design, the next step of this research project?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, our first step had been to understand people's experiences and then distill down to what their specific needs are. And then our next step was to try to design patient engagement tools, educational tools that can help address those needs. So we set up a human-centered design working group within the Patient Advisory Council. And in that working group, we had a human-centered design engineer, and we also had members from the apps for you to help with the patient engagement side of it, to make sure that it was a patient co-designed kind of process. And we started with pulling these themes that we heard from the patient interviews and then mapping them out onto specific types of products or educational tools that can help meet those. And after doing those, the human-centered design working group decided to create an infographic, which would be shared in hospitals so that patients have access to it through the healthcare providers. And the infographic had a QR code that would lead onto a website. And the website was really more of a repository of more information that helps patients be more empowered with what the blood testing process is like, but also what the different types of tests are, what the results may or may not mean. And on that website, we also had a video that was embedded for patients that walked them a little bit through the blood testing process, what they can expect and where they can ask questions, and that it's okay to ask questions. So those were the tools that were developed through the human-centered design process in response to the patient needs. The specific needs were mapped to every thing that we had in the tool, but the overarching sort of takeaway message for patients were, you have a right to ask questions at any step along the way. And please feel free to ask these questions. And that's really what we're trying to get across to our patients.
It's really to be empowering patients that they can be actively involved in their decision making, and one of it is ordering blood tests, for instance. And so the knowledge and the communication are the keys, as well as you need a relationship. You need time to build up a relationship. You need to listen, that you can build up this trust that patients actually then feel comfortable to ask the questions. And I think with creating the tools we did, like the infographic poster, what really explains step by step throughout your journey in the hospital, who is involved at which stage, and so in a language what is understandable. Like I mentioned before, avoiding sensitive images, for instance, like with big sharp needles and stuff. We took that out, that people who have a phobia about needles, that doesn't trigger anything negative. Having this tool, and then, as Anjula mentioned, having the connection from the tool, what is displayed in hospitals and hospital patient rooms, and now having the QR code there, going to the website, which shows a video again explaining more the different roles of healthcare practitioners. And now, so to deepen the understanding about who is who do I ask at which stage of the journey, and who is the right person to ask. And that I don't get put off and is like, oh, that's not my responsibility, or that's not my field of expertise, or I'm not allowed to tell you something. So really understanding the different roles. And then the website, the way how it was designed, to really, for the needs of the patients, to again understand more, having these links about the different blood tests, giving them more knowledge, but hopefully in a way they can understand and use then in their talk with the healthcare professionals, giving them information about results. What does it mean in a safe way? And not just like Google it and have all kinds of information what can trigger angst and anxieties, and also really credible information. And another part what I found really important is the links on the website we have for the health portals for patients, where patients can sign up and then can get the reports and other messages relating to their own health care. They can access that in an easy way. So that, to me, it's very important. And patients can choose, and we explain that they can choose to look up the results prior to their consult with the healthcare practitioner, or can use it afterwards, and they have a way where they can easily access and find their own healthcare information.
It's also important to note, and I know we can't cover everything in our short time together, that there's hundreds of hours of time from the patient researchers or patient research partners that they've contributed to working together throughout this project. So it's not just, I think it's important to sort of contextualize, because we can't get into everything we'd like to get into. And hopefully maybe we can cover some of this in part 2 when we meet with the patient research partners as part of this pack. But there's significant work that's been done here and contributions from the patient research partners on this team in the form of like hundreds of hours. So I think just to provide some context, and because I think when we sort of gloss over and share results and stuff like that, we don't really get the nitty gritty or the understanding of how much time commitment and the work that's been done on this project as a team. So you've talked a little bit about some of these tools that you've co-developed for patients, but also these educational tools that can help clinicians and patients. Do you want to elaborate on those educational efforts and how you can share this so clinicians learn more about it and they can involve patients in this communication, as well as patients on the flip side can be more involved in their care?
That's a great question. And that's where we're exactly at right now is the dissemination piece. I think the parts that we have been very successful with has been presenting at conferences. When people learn that mindset and the academic mindset, they're there to learn, we find we get a lot of interest. Our abstracts get accepted. We have a lot of traffic through our posters and presentations. I believe there was one conference where we even got the best poster presentation award. So there's a lot of recognition for the work that we do at conferences when people are in a more of a learning mindset, or presentations at journal clubs as well. In the day-to-day life of the hospitals is where we have the infographics all stuck up, and we try to tell people, use the QR code if you need more information, read it, and we try to get our healthcare providers to share that information. I do believe that uptake is slow. And I think part of that is because there's just a lot going on in the hospital at the time, both for the healthcare teams and for the patients. And sometimes it just feels like there's too many pieces all sort of around there. And it's hard for them to accept it all and understand it at the time, which is why what we're now focusing on is trying to say, maybe we want to empower people even before they get into hospital, or maybe after they've just left the hospital, when they're in a bit more of a better learning state and can do this. And same for the healthcare providers, rather than teach them while they're in the hospital, we try to use more teaching times outside of that to say, next time you're in the hospital and you're talking to your patients about blood work and so on, you can use this infographic and help contextualize to them sort of what to expect for blood work for the next few days and then the days after that. So that has been some of our learnings with the implementation piece, is when you go into the hectic kind of hospital environment, it's really hard for it to get uptake. You provide it there, so it's there, but you need to find people in times when they're in a more learning mode, which I think for patients can be in a time when they're not in the hospital. And for healthcare providers, also it's time when they're doing some sort of educational activity and teaching it at that point, and then hoping to get more uptake there.
Yeah, and I just can echo that, Anjula. But the power really is in the patient research partners helping facilitate in their own language, in their own words, a better understanding about the research finding and actually getting this message out. So as you mentioned before, like have patient research partner presenting at learning opportunities, at conferences, being co-authors at the manuscript, making sure that there is a lay summary in a language what is understandable. And as such, it really can foster the cooperation and the implementation stage. So peer-to-peer messages, in my opinion, in lay language, are more powerful than often publications in medical journal to drive change. So patient research partners are essential in getting the message out and the findings to the people who are most affected by it. And in our case, it is patients as well as the practitioners. So both are, and the working together facilitate communication. Having people with lived experience actively really involved as equal partners right from the start of the project, making sure the right questions are asked, and then throughout the whole research project. And again, especially in the implementation stage and the dissemination stage is of utter importance. The peer-to-peer messages, talking in, as we knew, language is important. If we want to drive change, we need the cooperation of the patients and the publics, as well as the practitioners. So if you want to drive change, we have to make sure we use positive language. Making sure, as you said in the beginning, having the right test for the right person at the right time. We have to make sure we have the resources to do that. So we cannot afford wasting healthcare resources, besides creating discomfort or maybe even harm to patients, what was mentioned earlier on, but using the resources wisely and reducing healthcare waste, what has a huge impact on the environment. So sustainability also has to be in the forefront and on the radar on an ongoing basis. Improving good value care, for instance, and instead of like just using the words reducing. And so focus on the positive outcomes. If you want the buy-in, if you want the cooperation and especially the public and the patients sticking with quality improvements or changes in healthcare system, the most effective way is really the peer-to-peer relation and talks. So people with lived experience, having them, like I said, actively involved as equal partners, addressing what really matters to the patients can really lead to outcomes who are meaningful and useful for everybody involved. To me, the project, the RePORT project, the way how it was done, like from inception throughout the whole research cycle, is a very powerful project in terms of getting the public voice, the patient voice, into the project with the respect what was shown to us, the training opportunities to really improve our research skills, and the teamwork, the co-developing of the outputs, and the relationship we have with each other is exemplary.
Yeah, it's a great example of a patient-oriented research study. Maybe we're all biased, but I think so. So you've both touched on the educational efforts as well as implementation. Do you have a way to measure the implementation and the outcomes of this work, or is that something that's still in the works?
So I can start with that from my perspective. So we're trying to do a mixed methods evaluation. So we're looking at numbers. We're also trying to hear patient participants' voices on this. So in terms of the quantitative side, we're trying to look to see overall if there's reduction in the repetitive use of lab tests. So that comes from administrative data and hospital data. And we look to see that with all the education on the patient side and also in parallel with the healthcare providers, are we seeing a safe reduction in the repetitive use of lab testing? We're also looking at patient outcomes. So, are patients doing well, equally as well in hospitals in terms of their length of stay? Are we seeing changes in readmissions rate or mortality rate or going to the ICU because we're doing this? We're looking at a lot of patient-specific outcomes in relation to this. We're also looking at the number of pokes that people are getting and complications from that. But we want to get more in-depth qualitative sort of responses from patients. So what we are concurrently doing is having in some of the hospitals where implementation has already occurred, have people go in and show the infographic to people to get some of their feedback on it and really discuss well, what's good about the infographic, but also how could the infographic be used to improve their care? So we're looking at it from both sides. Overall, we're here to reduce redundant use of testing. Is that happening? But B, we're also trying to do it with patients feeling that they can advocate for their care more and feel more empowered. Are we accomplishing that through the tools that we've created?
It's a very person-centered care approach because we're involving all care team members, including the patients being at the center of their care. So I love to hear about all of this work that you're doing. So looking ahead, what are some of the next steps of or ongoing research initiatives stemming from the RePORT study outcomes, or what are you currently working on?
Yeah, so in terms of next steps, we're in the process of collecting the data from patients currently in hospitals and their feedback on the current tools. So I believe we've conducted 12 interviews so far and received lots of survey responses on how people thought about how useful or not they felt these tools were. So we're kind of going through that data. We're obviously going to need to adapt and modify these tools based on what we hear. Currently, the data that we've gathered is only from Alberta, and as we implement in more hospitals in BC, we'll concurrently do that for BC as well. So the goal is to make sure that the tools do reflect and improve the care of patients who are frontline. So that's one piece. And the second piece is just the implementation and spreading the word and the dissemination piece of it. We have these tools. We'll hear from patients as to whether we need to make more changes. We might make more changes to it. But the end goal is to make sure that we integrate that into hospital flow and processes. And we'd like to essentially make it so that it becomes part of the cultural practice in hospitals, at least in Alberta and BC, that when patients come in, they get a bit of an orientation of this is what hospitalization is like, this is what you can expect, this is what the blood testing process is like, this is what you can expect. And these are the ways where you can voice your questions. These are the avenues where you can, advocate for your needs and so on. And these tools just become part of what people do and becomes part of hospitalization and practice there. So that's sort of our eventual goal, is to get these all integrated. And that's what we're working on. As I mentioned, the peer-to-peer messaging helps. As much as possible, we're trying to share our learnings with our meetings when we have meetings with healthcare providers as well. And in the future, we'd like to have more patient partners speak directly to them as well, so they really feel it more. The struggle that we are in right now is that people are just so busy, and they have been in hospitals. It's really hard to secure some of the meeting times, and it's really been hard for people to be in a learning state because you're just coming out of what I would call like a survival chaos state, where it's just been like, let's just get the work done, right? Let's just make sure things are falling through the cracks. And I'm hoping that people are in hospitals are now moving to the mindset of, okay, poof, the pandemic is over. We're in the growth mindset as opposed to survival mindset. And in that growth mindset, we just integrate that at that point.
Yeah, that was a really important point you said, like in terms of the learning sessions for healthcare practitioners within hospital settings, for instance, and inviting patients, inviting people with the lived experience to tell their stories. Stories usually stick. And these will help with taking a pause, practitioners discussing with their patients, and patients then also feeling is like they can say it's like, okay, stop and just look at it. Is it necessary? Do we have to do it? Can we spread out the tests, for instance? And so it's a learning together. It's a working together, being a team in one's care.
I think maybe Anshula, you mentioned earlier that there's a lot going on in the hospital. I think for everyone, like you said, for both patients and clinicians, I believe this type of work with the idea of involving people in their care and communication, conversations, learning, sharing of information helps to alleviate some of the anxiety for patients. And I would say probably improve the work environment for clinicians, is sort of a better, more positive work environment when they feel like it's more meaningful as well. So I think this work is really amazing. I'm wondering, just to sort of wrap up, if you could each share any message that you want to leave with the audience.
From a patient perspective, like I mentioned, to me, it was a really empowering project, getting so much training provided, to have the skills to feel comfortable, to, for instance, be a co-interviewer and then analyze the data, creating or co-creating these tools, but also really powerful to be able to speak at conferences, create a poster and speak at conferences to the healthcare providers and explain it from a patient perspective. So I'm really grateful that to have had this opportunity and being involved in this project.
Thanks, Annie.
Yeah, speaking as a clinician scientist, I think my biggest takeaway and things that I would ask people to do is I can't imagine now doing a project without having patient partners involved, patient research partners involved right from the very beginning, because it makes such a big difference in just how we view things and how we even shape the research question, and so much inspiration for like expanding out and asking other questions. So that's something I would leave every member of the audience to think. It's like every project has a place for patient engagement. You just have to find how it is and where you can enrich your study with it. And I agree with Annie, you form really long-lasting relationships and you're all in it together. And I actually really think, particularly for this project, because there was a risk of this project coming across as feeling like this is the government and the, clinicians and the hospitals trying to save money by not doing enough tests. And I think that story completely changed when our patient partners present, and they present from the standing of, I don't want my body to be impacted and my blood to be drawn for things that are not wise use of my blood and dollars. So I think that narrative completely changed when we took the person-centered approach for this project. So I'm very grateful for that as well.
Thanks, Anshila, and thank you both for joining in today's discussion. Congratulations on all the work you've done. I know you have several publications that's come from this work as well. So I will link them with this podcast. And to let the audience know, there is a part 2 of this podcast where we are talking specifically to past and present co-chairs, but also patient research partners that are part of the Patient Advisory Council, to really sort of dig into what it's like being a patient research partner, working together in health research. So please go to part 2 to learn more about this study. And thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Pep Talks, the Patient Engagement Podcast, brought to you by the Alberta Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Patient Engagement Team. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you found it, and we hope you'll join us again for more interesting discussions about patient engagement in health research and healthcare.